All right, we're going to go ahead and get this debate started. I'm going to be the presiding officer for this round, and we are also going to start off with Representative Bryce Fant and Representative Payson Epley with the bill to halt all arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So be it enacted by the Congress here assembled that Section 1, the United States shall halt future arms sales to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Section 2, arms sales shall be defined as the trade or sale of weaponry and ammunition, including battle tanks and machine guns. Section 3, the Department of Defense are responsible for the enforcement of this legislation. Failure to comply with this legislation will result in the budget of the responsible department to be decreased by 30% for 5 years. Section 4, this bill will go into effect on January 1st, 2021. Section 5, all laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. Representative Bryce Fant, you do have the floor.
When a man carries an instrument of violence, he will always find a justification to use this. Western philosopher Brian Vaughan once said this, and when we're asked the question on whether or not we should halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, I can think of no better person to quote than him himself. So in order to help answer why we should halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, we'll go through two key points of analysis. The first, that Saudi Arabia has been negligent with United States weaponry, and the second is that other solutions have long been ineffective, and we'll go over those later. So let's jump straight into our first point of analysis, or more importantly, the negligence with U.S. weaponry that Saudi Arabia has shown. According to an interview conducted by CNN on the 28th of August in 2018, reports that when prompted, United States Secretary of Defense James Mattis was finally asked the question, at what point is enough enough? This was obviously in reference to some of the deaths that have occurred due to United States weaponry in the hands of the Saudi Arabian military. Now, to go further upon this, looking at an article posted by The Guardian on the 19th of August in 2018, is that one of the strikes ended in 51 deaths and 79 people being injured. The matter of fact was that it was a school bus full of children, completely innocent children. Now, this wasn't the problem with the weapon. That's what some of the things that people prompt with this, is that the weapon is what caused the problem. But we easily see that with the GBU-12 Payway 2, it's a laser-guided missile with a near 0% failure rate. And the matter of fact is that it was negligence on the Saudi Arabian Air Force's problem that caused this issue in the first place. So we see that Saudi Arabia has been negligent with the weapons that they have simply because they can. And now we move on to my second point, the other solutions being ineffective. If we look at an article posted by USA Today on the 12th of September in 2018, our government has long been turning a blind eye. In fact, the Department of Defense has long recognized some of the human rights violations that Saudi Arabia has been committing in the proxy wars with Yemen. Now, the matter of fact is that, again, they've been negligent with most of the issues that we've seen today, and the United States government recognizes, and we've been completely blind to it and haven't taken action. So, in order to help spread democracy in today's world, we shouldn't do it through arms sales. We should do it with the power that we have with our economy, and we should do it with the power that we have with other nations, instead of selling arms, causing wars, and having people die simply because we want to provide and build our economy based off of a war.
What will happen to the terrorist-led civil war right now in Yemen?
Okay, so the matter of fact is that the terrorist-led war is a problem within that country, but we can't keep providing military weapons to help aid bloodshed in that war when it's causing these problems.
So should we let terrorism run rampant in Yemen instead and let people die that way?
Absolutely not. The way that we should solve this problem is not through aiding with weapons, but instead aiding through the economy and providing human rights aids rather than giving them the weapons to kill people in school buses.
And what happens when countries like Iran keep funding terrorists who are killing civilians just as equally?
That should be the problem with the United States. Instead of using Saudi Arabia as a proxy, the United States should act on their own behalf instead of using Saudi Arabia as a way to solve their problem.
So ignore the terrorism and attack the country directly?
Absolutely not. What we should use is the United States arsenal instead of selling weapons into hands that we can't control entirely.
All right, that's time. Thank you. Representative Payson Epley, you have the floor.
Hello? Maybe. Oh, turn it on. Hello? There we go. Hi, guys. I want to share a story with all of you. A story of a powerful nation lending weapons to a smaller nation, but then turning around and condemning it, halting arms sales, even placing sanctions. This country then turns around, gets funded by Russia, now has its own nuclear arsenal to dispense, and now has citizens screaming death to America in the streets. This isn't Saudi Arabia that I'm referencing, but instead Iran, the person leading the proxy war right now in Yemen. The fact is we can't let them run this war, run this terrorism, because right now we're funding one side. If we stop funding one side, then the other side falls. Not only this brief look of history affects our decision on this piece of legislation, but also these two key points. First, the reality of the Middle East. And then second, looking at the importance of American influence. Looking at the reality of the Middle East, the Human Rights Watch does go on to explain that there have been unlawful bombings from Saudi Arabia. That happens to be the only human rights violation upon them. When we have the enemy, when we have terrorists in Yemen from Iran who are raping, beheading, and spreading fear in the Middle East. But not only in the Middle East. In cases like 9/11, spreading fear directly to American soil. If we don't take attack to the reality of the Middle East, that this is an ideology and that simply using our economy and telling them don't bomb people, it's not going to work. Looking at the power of American influence. Saudi Arabia in no way is it perfect, but it is growing faster than any other Middle Eastern country. James Cordsman, a chairman of the SIS organization, goes on to explain that we need a non-radical and a trusting ally in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is taking great bounds that we never even thought possible. They've lifted the ban of allowing women to drive. They've also arrested several corrupt leaders in the Jamal Khashoggi killings, and even the commanders and generals in charge of these bombings. Overall, let us not ignore history. Let us not remain stagnant and allow history to repeat itself, where in the end, people are harmed. Civilians are harmed. But we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to see that we need to do anything we can to halt the radical ideology spreading through Yemen and spreading through Iran.
All right, so should we really be solving the problems in the Middle East by using weapons instead of using the arsenal that the United States has with its economy?
Okay, so the problem is if you're using our arsenal of economy, they're still using weapons. And then you have, instead of a war, you have a slaughter.
Okay, but if we cut off all these weapons in the main sense that they're not getting the weapons from us, aren't we solving some of the issues we see with negligence with such powerful weapons?
Again, Iran terrorists aren't being negligent. Instead, they're completing their mission, and we're not going to be stopping them if we don't have weapons on the right side.
But isn't the resolution talking about Saudi Arabia specifically?
Yes, we need to look at what Saudi Arabia is doing with those weapons, and although they're not perfect, they are halting terrorism spreading through Iran.
That now brings us to our next piece of legislation with Representative Alessandra Gutierrez and Hannah Kim. This is a bill to limit vaccine exemptions to reinforce herd immunity. Be enacted by the Congress here assembled at Section 1. The United States federal government shall hereby require that for a child to be exempt from the CDC vaccination schedule, the child's parents must provide written authorization from a doctor based on a health risk posed to the children. Exemptions include both religious and philosophical exemptions. The vaccines that will be mandated are hepatitis B, MMR, and hepatitis A. If parents fail to have their child vaccinated for any reason other than medical exemptions, they will not be allowed to attend public school at any level. Herd immunity is defined as a communal resistance to the spread of a contagious disease with a population that results from 90% to 95% of individuals being vaccinated. Section 3, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education will work in conjunction to prevent unvaccinated children from attending school. Section 3, Part A. The Department of Education will share all information pertaining to vaccinations with the Department of Health and Human Services. Section 3, Part B. If any school fails to meet the previous mentioned criteria, they will be denied every single type of federal education funding. Section 4. This bill should go into effect by 2020. Section 5. All laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. Representative Alessandra Gutierrez, you do have the floor.
A commonly accepted piece of advice states, discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you need most. Keeping that in mind, we can look at the current polarization within the United States today between the uprising wave of parents not wanting to vaccinate their children and those on the opposition. However, by looking at two key areas of analysis, we can see that we must pass today's piece of legislation in order to limit vaccine exemptions and not allow herd immunity to fall to risk. So first, we have to look at the insufficiency of current laws in place in regards to exemptions on vaccines. According to the American Academy of Family Physicians, on July 20th of 2018, recent studies find quote-unquote disturbing trends in vaccination exemptions, causing a dangerously high risk for outbreaks here domestically. This is credited to the increase in non-medical exemptions in 2/3 of all states allowing philosophical exemptions in the last year alone. The AAFP furthermore sees potential for outbreak in 7 highly populated areas across the United States, including our very own Houston, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, this can only be due to how easy it is to receive exemptions, especially with some states only requiring a bona fide to receive a religious exemption, and other states requiring nothing more than an online education course on vaccines to receive a philosophical exemption. Therefore, although we might not see a huge risk now, we have to protect ourselves and future generations in regard to these spreadable diseases. Additionally, we have to look at the ethical reasoning behind passing today's piece of legislation. The negation may come up here and discuss the supposed infringement of rights that this bill presents. However, we can see that the opposite is true because there is a fine line between protecting individual rights for beliefs that parents may or may not actually have and placing our constituency at risk. We are already seeing outbreaks, what Al Jazeera on April 2nd of 2019 recognizes as the highest rates of certain preventable diseases in the United States that we have seen in decades. These diseases are already on the rise, and in order to protect ourselves and our children, we have to pass today's legislation. So after looking at the insufficiency of current laws and the greater good, there is no other logical option.
Thank you. That is now 30-second cross-examination period.
Representative, how is this bill actually addressing insufficiency of current laws?
Well, currently, this is the only suggestion we have in order to combat the insufficiency of current laws. So we present this bill, we get more sufficient laws.
Isn't this bill an overreach of the federal government?
Of course not. We already see precedents with the federal government engaging with vaccine exemptions. So by passing this legislation, we're only furthering that precedence and allowing the federal government to do its job.
But is it not true that in the status quo, the states have control over who gets what exemptions in their state?
Well, yes and no. The federal government does require some requirements from these states, so they still have precedence.
Thank you. If we allow the government to disregard individual rights with this vaccines bill, will there be a precedent set in the future?
Of course not, because we're disregarding the individual rights with passing this piece of legislation. We're only protecting our constituency.
But isn't it true that there could be a slippery slope of precedent set between this vaccines bill because vaccines is a fundamental right of personal belief?
No, there is no slippery slope involved.
Thank you.
The United States is built on the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, with the issue of vaccines, these rights are being jeopardized. While there is concern over the recent outbreaks, we must negate this bill to limit vaccine exemptions to reinforce herd immunity because of 2 key reasons. First, the fundamental rights of the United States citizen and the failure of this bill to actually reinforce herd immunity. While the affirmation might claim that the rights of the individual should not be considered over the rights of the majority, the United States is founded on the inalienable individual rights provided by the Constitution. In fact, the very First Amendment claims freedom of religion and personal belief. This legislation is trampling on the fundamental rights of the constituency, and the nation has a responsibility to protect the rights of each individual as much as the majority. So we must negate this bill. Further, contrary to the affirmative's claim, this piece of legislation presented today does not adequately reinforce herd immunity. The bill outlines herd immunity as a communal resistance that results from 90 to 95% of the population being vaccinated. However, in the status quo, Contemporary Pediatrics on November 29th of 2018 states that 90% of children are vaccinated, well within herd immunity. Another article published on ABC on October 23rd of 2018 states that the CDC reports show that 1.3% of the population is not vaccinated, meaning 98.7% are fully vaccinated within the United States, well surpassing the standards for herd immunity. This bill is only disregarding the rights of the individual while not creating any actual change and reinforcing herd immunity, as herd immunity is strong in the country, is not at risk, and does not show any indication that it will be under risk in the future. There is an understandable concern in the United States, but this bill is not the solution, as this bill only infringes on the fundamental rights of the United States citizen and does not reinforce herd immunity in any way. We must vote negation on this bill.
Representative, even if herd immunity isn't at a major risk in the status quo, does that not mean that we aren't in a state of risk for the future?
As I outlined in my speech, the United States is well above and surpassing the standards for herd immunity, and there's no indication that there's any future risk presented. So by negating this bill, we're not going to be hurting any of the United States population.
Are increasing rates of exemptions not posing an indication of risk?
No, because even as we've seen a rise happening recently, we are still well within the limits of herd immunity, and as I've said, there's no risk actually proven.
So why should the supposed rights of individuals that may or may not actually have beliefs against vaccines come before the health of our constituency?
Because there's no actual risk being posed right now, all this bill is doing is going to be trampling on the fundamental rights of each of the United States citizens.
Question.
To our next piece of legislation, which will include Representative Grace Shelton and Representative Wyatt Hayes. This is a bill to promote privacy for public officials. Being enacted by the Congress here assembled that Section 1, the United States federal government mandate a minimum of 1 year of confidentiality be set for documents of public officials before they become accessible for public viewing to protect the privacy of public officials and their families. Section 2, public official is defined as any individual who holds political office. Documents is defined as any written form of work from a public official with intent of political reform or action, or any document from a court hearing of a public official. Section 3, the United States Department of Justice will oversee the implementation of this bill. Section 3, Part A. Any individual or organization that does not comply will receive a fine determined by a court of law where adequate compensation will be decided based on the severity of the repercussions of the individual's or organization's actions. Section 4. This bill shall go into effect in the fiscal year of 2021. Section 5. All laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. Representative Shelton, you have the floor.
With the upcoming 2020 presidential election, I'm sure many of us are thinking back to 2016. What went wrong? Why was everybody so subtly worried about Hillary Clinton's emails and Donald Trump's past? We often forget that public officials need just as much privacy as American citizens, because they are, in fact, American citizens. So we passed today's piece of legislation first, because government officials need to be allowed the privacy and the privilege to deliberate with one another to allow progressive change to be made in the United States. According to The Atlantic on November 1st of 2018, for the same reasons that individual citizens need privacy so that they can better formulate ideas, so too do government officials to engage in frank discussions aimed at finding intelligent solutions. If we look at America's roots, passages such as the Constitution, the Louisiana Purchase, and the XYZ affair, all were screened away from public intervention. If we allow government officials to be able to deliberate with one another, we're allowing that the United States is going to have better passage in laws and in change. We must pass today's piece of legislation because the negation is only affirming that they are allowing their constituents to vote for them again in their upcoming term. We are only allowing that their constituency remains intact and that they are not at all solving for the American constituent at all. But moreover, let's actually look at some arguments that are going to be made by the negation today. More specifically, a Supreme Court case from 1964, Sullivan versus New York Times. What this Supreme Court entails is that the New York Times spoke out against racial segregation in the South. And in 1964, racial segregation and the civil rights movement was at an all-time high. This court case has nothing to do with this piece of legislation and is a broad interpretation at best as for a reason to negate today's piece of legislation. This also is another reason that the constitutionality argument made by the negation is going to be dropped. They're using this Supreme Court case as one of the main reasons that this goes against the Constitution, when in fact this is bolstering the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment alludes to the privacy of all American citizens, and if we don't allow this to be upheld like we've done in the past, we're not doing our jobs as congressmen, and we are not fulfilling the American constituents' desire for us. So I ask the negation today to look towards the legislation, look towards the Constitution, and look towards your own arguments, because when they're brought up against the act, they ultimately fail.
Representative, if this bill is passed, will all politicians' actions not be hidden from the voting public?
Not at all, because the voting public, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you're always going to vote for your party. As we saw in 2016, apparently past doesn't matter. So Democrat is always going to vote for Democrat, and Republican is always going to vote Republican.
Well, how do we know that if the information is going to be hidden for 1 full year after a legal case might have happened that would change a voter's mind if they found out about it?
Because these citizens are still going to know what's going on. They're still going to know that their representative from their party is going to be either passing controversial legislation or talking about controversial legislation, or they're in a court case. All that's being excluded is the minute details that make up these court cases, that make up this legislation, that prevents them from being safe. Thanks.
Fellow representatives, we all know how big of an issue public information regarding officials is. With the November hearings involving Brett Kavanaugh, we directly saw how public information was able to connect vital pieces of the case, such as who is involved and what changes our constituents need to make when electing politicians to represent them on the federal stage. You will see through the information I give to you that this legislation, although it has good intentions, fails to address the issue at hand and actually causes more problems than it fixes. And I say this for 2 main reasons. The first being that our constituents want the information to be public, and the second being that the federal government should not be the deciding factor for this matter. So, to build off of my first point, our constituents have an extensive responsibility to know who they're voting for, as it is their constitutional right. Those who argue in the affirmation for this bill want to avoid the past judicial precedents of New York Times v. Sullivan, which was dated in 1964. If you actually look at what the Supreme Court ruled, you will see that they decided politicians have no right to sue a media source for the publication of private information, no matter how damaging that information may be. They saw that American citizens should know exactly who they are voting for now, not 1 year after an election was held. This legislation allows politicians to avoid a public discourse about their actions, and the American people will ultimately feel betrayed. According to a Pew Research poll done on January 1st of 2019, 91% of Democrats and 32% of Republicans want President Donald Trump to release his tax returns and make them public. We have seen enough similar opinions from our constituents involving failure to release information to the public, such as the unredacted Mueller report, information on how terrorists are treated, and even information regarding the 2013 data dump made by Edward Snowden. And this brings me to my second point, which is that this is not an issue the federal government has jurisdiction over, as the states have already made a decision regarding this legislation. According to the National Conference of State Legislators in 2018, 42 states within our country have strict ethics laws regarding the private information of public officials or politicians. Ethics laws in the majority of these states require officials to release information about debts owed, property owned, gifts received or given, client lists, legal suits, both criminal and civil, and even details regarding their family. Each of these have the factor to be hidden under this legislation. Obviously, this legislation is incomplete at best and needs more time to be written so that the issue of privacy in public officials can be properly addressed. Our constituents deserve to know who they are voting for. They deserve complete transparency, and they deserve the responsibility to participate in our democracy in the most informed manner possible. For these reasons, please stand with me in a firm negation.
Representative, you acknowledged in your first point that the Kavanaugh case was blown widely out of proportions. However, you still suggest that the state level solves for this issue. How can the national level not have a better solvency for this issue rather than the state level?
Well, obviously, whenever we're passing this piece of legislation, we're not only talking about the national level, we're also talking about the state level, as it doesn't specify within this legislation who exactly is going to be, or who this legislation is going to be enforced to. And then also to hit your second point, the Kavanaugh cases were a very eye-opening thing for the United States, and as I said in my speech, it allowed our constituents to see what exactly went wrong and what changes they need to make when electing public officials in the future.
Can I have time? Okay. So Representative, I understand your concerns about how terrorists are treated, but I don't understand why the citizens of America want to know or want to have minute details such as tax return, debt owed, gifts paid for from public officials. Can you explain why that is such a big deal in the United States today?
Well, if you actually listened to my speech, you would have heard that I talked about legal cases too, which was within this legislation under the umbrella. This would be hidden by this legislation, and the voting public would not be able to see this information until 1 year after an election was held, and this legal cases or something like that could possibly change the voters' mind.